Austin, what are the strengths of this football team? We'll get to questions in a moment and how this differs from maybe Josh Heupel's first year or second year, but some strengths you can feel good about heading into fall camp for this Tennessee football team.
I think because they're senior heavy. Now there are some players that in theory could be back next year, or in the case of Bryson Eason, 2 years from now, if they wanted to. Now, I'm not sure kids want to stay 6 years if they can avoid it. But I think the fact that they've got some veteran, it's kind of veteran led. I think that helps this team quite a bit. I love where they're at receiver. I love where they're at running back. I think they're fine at tight end as far as as long as everybody can stay healthy. That's a big if. I still worry about their secondary. I feel like they're in a pretty good spot at linebacker. I love their young pieces. They love their young pieces. And I think Peely and Aaron Beasley are two guys that, will lead. So, I think there's a lot of things to like about this team, but there are some question marks, a couple of holes on the offensive line and the back end of that secondary. It's something I still kind of got to see to believe.
Rob Lewis, what do you think the strengths are of this football team? We talk so much about Joe Milton, the quarterback position and everything, and it's kind of weird that you call that a strength because, again, he's unproven here at Tennessee, but would you consider the quarterback position a strength, at least compared to what it was 2 years ago?
Yeah, relative to that kind of unknown, I think for certain. And Joe's got it's not a huge body of work, but we've fans have seen him, and I think more importantly they've seen tangible improvement from when he kind of sort of won the starter's job in 2021 to what you saw last year. And again, he wasn't in a lot of high pressure situations, but he was at the end of the year. I mean, that was the Vanderbilt game ended up being a blowout. But if you guys remember the week leading up to that game, after the South Carolina game, all the noise around the program, and
Vanderbilt just beat Florida and somebody else as well.
I mean, that was not that there was a lot of uncertainty that week, and that was a high pressure situation that Joe performed well in, and certainly the Orange Bowl. I think really sort of gave you a glimpse of how far he has come in 2 years in the program. So I would call quarterback a strength. I mean, it's not, not the strength that it probably was last year after what Hendon had done, but compared to what it can be some years, I would definitely call it that.
And Brent, I think in order for Joe Milton to certainly be a strength of this football team, more so than just kind of knowing what you have in him right now, he's going to have to rely on that offensive line that's got some question. Of course, a running game, top to bottom, no Superman, but I think one of the better rooms probably top to bottom in the SEC.
Yeah, I mean, I think my biggest strength for this team, if you're not going specific position, is you got the two most important components to this team know how to run this offense at the pace they want to run it at. And so you're not trying to bring a young quarterback up to speed with the pace of play. It's one thing to practice it fast. It's another thing, and with all the emotions of playing a game, to play it fast. Joe's played it fast. He's played it fast in games. And we obviously know what Cooper Mays can do. So I think that is a strength, that you're not going through this learning curve of a new quarterback or a new center who's trying to get this thing going to the tempo they want, which obviously is something that plays into their hands and is a big, not the sole part, but is a large part of what they do offensively to make them successful. The run game I like the tailbacks. But again, you've got to answer the question, a couple of questions on the offensive line. What does Campbell do at tackle? We'll see. Love him at center. I think Spraggins is fine at guard. I think he's solid. The other guard spot, we'll see. And the other tackle spot, we'll see exactly what that looks like. But you're taking two tackles into the right tackle position, three if you count Dane Davis, who have all started SEC games. So that counts. The other thing, too, about this offensive line, and I'm not downplaying anything Glenn Ellerby does or what this line, what this group of guys do. They don't have to be the most physically dominant guys based on the scheme because they spread people out so much. They've got to create gaps and create seams, which I think is something that you can do without Austin being just this tremendous Trey Smith road grader. Not to say he wouldn't have thrived in the system, because he would have, but you don't have to have 4 or 5 guys that play and maul like that for this offense to be successful.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, I'm interested to see what they are on short yardage. 2 years ago, not so great. Last year they were really, really good. I mean, borderline just dominant in short yardage. What is this offensive line? What's this run game look like in short yardage situations when they're going tempo and they've got to pick up a 3rd and 1 or whatever? What do they look like? And I think it's important to remember too is while Rob says Joe's a strength, and I don't disagree. Like, what do they have behind him? What do they have behind Cooper Mays? So like you're an injury or two away from being like, whoa, what this is really different, right? So like, I mean, deep in certain areas, other areas though, I would argue super thin and like got to keep everybody healthy. Like I think Hubs, you joked with me in fall camp about fall camp, like wrapping Cooper Mays in bubble wrap. And I mean, like, I don't disagree. I mean, like the one guy they can't afford to lose besides Joe would be Cooper. I mean, like makes it all go.
Yeah, I agree. I think the other thing too is we live in a world and day and age of college football where nobody's going to be ultimately deep. Okay. I mean, look, Georgia's got quarterbacks. Okay. They've got multiple quarterbacks. They don't have any experience, but you think they have talent, multiple quarterbacks. Who's Jaden Daniels back up at LSU, right? I mean, you've got lots of places, the day and age of having 3 deep across the board. Those guys, the talented ones aren't staying. If they're not playing, they're moving on. And so I think everybody has some of those things. But Austin, your point is exactly right. In a couple of key areas, center being the biggest key for me, that's a real concern. They have to find a backup center this fall. Now, he's not going to be Cooper Mays, but they've got to find somebody that they feel comfortable with being a center if called upon or has to be called upon in critical situations in a football game.
Carvin wasn't Cooper Mays, but he was just steady Eddie. And when Cooper went down 2 years ago, Jerome moved over, and Tennessee wasn't as fast with the tempo, but there wasn't any hiccups in terms of getting lined up, just your normal stuff.
And he was physically he was physically good enough to play too. I mean, that's the thing. Their backup right now has no experience, so you don't know how physically they handle. Eric, I'll ask you this question when it comes to the short yardage stuff. Tennessee was vastly improved, as Austin mentioned, from year 1 to year 2. The Hendon Hooker element to that, I think, was a big part of why they were improved in that short yardage situation to sort of help the offensive line as well. What does that run game look like with the quarterback in short yardage? Because everybody had to account for Hendon Hooker. How much does everybody want to or defensively feel like they have to account for Joe Milton as a mobile quarterback? That's something we won't know till they get into games.
Yeah, that's something we won't know until we see it kind of evolve, game 1, game 2, game 3. I mean, Joe Milton running the football is certainly not going to be Hendon Hooker, but Joe can run the football. And really all it takes is to get on film once or twice, and on 3rd and short, 4th and short, they go out of shotgun. I mean, the defenses will be respecting Joe Milton for sure and his ability to keep it and that read option and go or whatever the case is, maybe a power, and try to pick up a couple yards. So I think just getting it on tape a couple of times, which I believe he can do early on, will keep defenses honest in that respect. You also can't go offset eye with Princeton Fan, or at least you don't have the ability to right now. Maybe they'll do something at some point this season, but Princeton Fan is gone. Who's going to be your bigger back? Is it just going to be who's out there? Could you find out a role maybe for Cam Selden or somebody else down the line? We'll see, but I don't think we're going to find those answers out in fall camp, of course. You move over to the defense side of the football, then we'll kind of shift gears and talk a little bit of weaknesses. I know we've already talked about that, but Rob, I think also mentioned this earlier, but at linebacker for the first time in the Josh Heupel regime, you're deep at linebacker, and you feel like you could rotate 5, maybe 6 guys in there and be okay, whereas you've always rotated guys up front, and of course you've got tons of experience in the back end that need to take a step. But in that middle layer where you're playing run and pass, you feel good about the depth options there and a nice blend of veterans and newcomers.
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned the difference in 2021. I mean, who would have thought that 2 years ago that we would sit in here, feeling about Aaron Beasley the way that you feel about him, as a linebacker, somebody who's really proven that he can play at a high level in the SEC. I mean, I never would have thought that. And Keenan Peely, he's got to be a hit. I mean, he's got to be a plug and play guy for all that depth talk to be accurate. But I mean, you would. All the signs point to him being that. I mean, he's played a ton of football. He was a freshman back in 2016, before going on his mission. I mean, so maturity is not an issue. he was a team captain at BYU, and Elijah Herring, Perry got their feet wet last year, and I think everybody thinks that Arian Carter is going to be somebody that maybe pushes to at least get a niche role like Herring had last year as a freshman.
A niche role. Austin Price 3 weeks ago called him the leading tackler on the football team. That was his prediction going into the season, right? Right, AP?
You're as bad as some of the GQ that here.
What a hot take! He said mark it down.
Here ABC and then regurgitate AJM.
I love to watch his blood pressure rise. It's almost as fun as y'all watching mine rise.
Well, I'm interested to kind of see where Elijah Herring is. Everybody I've talked to says he's had a phenomenal offseason. Peely, he wasn't who he was 2 years ago when he was coming off the ACL this past year at BYU. Everybody says it takes that second year. I mean, look at Ronald Acuna with the Braves. Last year, kind of, and then back to his old self this year. Is he back to his old self? At the linebacker spot, this year, it's something I think you have to pay attention to. Rob, your kids, one just graduated high school. The other, graduated what year, Rob? When did Dylan graduate?
COVID year, 2020.
2020. Now think about that, okay? Dylan's, an upperclassman at UT. Keenan Peely played his freshman year of college when Dylan was like a freshman in high school. I mean, this kid is so old he can rent a car now. That's official. And when anytime that happens, you've got a veteran guy. Of course, we all talk about him being married, but he's loving this area, man. Loving going fishing. He's loving everything about this, and I think we'll just be a true pros pro for this team. Again, I love the veteran part of this whole team. I think that it really helps some of the unknowns, heading into this year.
Yeah, to put Peely in perspective for me, my son just graduated from basic training last week. He was 11 when Keenan Peely went to BYU to play football.
That's even better.
I mean, so there you go. I mean, the guy's an old man for sure, but he's got to hit, as Rob said. If they do there, then the old Haywood Harris adage could play right into Tennessee's hands defensively. As he always said, you got to be able to run the dive play and you got to be able to stop the dive play, which means you better be able to protect the middle of the football field in the run game with Amari Thomas, what they have in the inside with Eason and those guys. If Peely and those linebackers can play the way we think, this team has a chance to be salty against the run again, which would certainly help this defense continue to take the steps like they took a step from year 1 to year 2. Eric.
Especially the secondary grows.
Yeah, our AP was still playing Corn Ferry Tour courses when Keenan Peely was a freshman.
I'm curious on Peely to see kind of where he is in pass coverage. I mean, linebackers aren't meant to be covering the number one wideout and man to man here, but you got to take your drops and you got to get deep and to help your secondary out. And year 2 off that ACL, what's that kind of look like? Covering number 3 receivers coming across the middle in the SEC.
Well, the one thing I'll say, he played in a league that's pretty wide open. Okay, I mean he wasn't. No offense to the Big Ten folks, but he didn't come out of a league where he played, but in the box only at linebacker. At BYU, you had to play some in space because a lot of those teams were running the spread, a lot of zone reads, and a lot of quick stuff across the middle, that type of thing. So at least he's seen it. Maybe not with this kind of athlete, Eric, but I do think there's some knowledge there that maybe a guy coming out of a different conference would not have the same knowledge.